Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026. The God Committee. Just distribution of scarce medical resources and personal responsibility. This chapter focuses on two questions. Just allocation and personal responsibility for health. Every day, someone gets access to expensive medical resources, and someone does not. In 1962, the famous God Committee in Seattle decided which patients received dialysis and which did not. In distributing such scarce resources in medicine, does it make sense to ask who deserves it? Should smokers with emphysema get lung transplants? Should alcoholics get liver transplants? Several distributive standards conflict in answering that question. An impartial Kantian approach distributes an impersonal lottery. But utilitarians focus on maximizing years lived per machine or organ. Others focus on personal characteristics of the recipient, either to exclude one class or to identify the most deserving. Finally, we can let the media identify a patient for the organ or machine, a way called the rule of rescue. The God Committee and artificial kidneys. The kidneys remove toxins accumulated by normal cellular metabolism in the blood. When both kidneys fail, toxins accumulate to lethal levels. Hemodialysis, literally tearing blood apart, substitutes for the kidneys. It removes blood from the body and sends it through cannulas where a surrounding solution absorbs toxins by osmosis through a semi-permeable membrane. Then, the cleansed blood is returned to the body. Patients in renal failure must undergo hemodialysis, more simply dialysis, for several hours, 2 or 3 times a week. The process doesn't cure kidney renal failure and leaves patients tired and cranky, with lives revolving around appointments. To get off dialysis, most patients want to get a kidney transplant. Willem Kolff invented the hemodialysis machine in the Netherlands in 1943. He also later worked on artificial hearts with Robert Jarvik. Kolff converted an automobile's fuel pump to force blood to and from the body for cleansing. for each session of dialysis, surgeons connected cannulas to arteries and veins. Because an artery or vein could only be used only once, surgeons soon exhausted all sites. In 1960, physician Belding Scribner in Seattle invented the indwelling shunt, a piece of tubing permanently attached to one vein and to one artery, allowing blood to flow continuously. Like a spigot, the shunt could be shut off between dialysis. Machine and a permanent shunt meant that he and Kolff had created an artificial kidney, a machine that could sustain life. This breakthrough led to something wonderful. Thousands of dying renal patients would now live. It also led to a new ethical issue. Given the scarcity of machines, what criteria of distributive justice would be used to select who would live and who would die. When Belding Scribner developed his shunt, inpatient dialysis cost $20,000 a year. Because it was experimental, insurance companies refused to pay for it. Such companies do not cover experimental treatment in order to hold down costs. When proven therapeutic, the treatments were covered. Scribner's Swedish hospital dialyzed its first patients without charging them, but in 1962 told Scribner he could admit no more patients for dialysis. By then, Scribner had a year's experience with dialysis and tried dialysis outside the hospital in an outpatient dialysis center. That center could serve 17 patients, but many more were eligible. From the beginning, the ethical problem arose. Who shall live when not all can? Instead of leaving this problem for distributive justice to physicians, Swedish Hospital Scribner, or King County Medical Society, took the unusual step of creating an admissions and policy committee to decide who would get a dialysis machine. Scribner wrote in 1972, "As I recall that period, all of us who were involved felt that we had found a fairly reasonable and simple solution to an impossibly difficult problem by letting a committee of responsible members of the community choose which patients would receive treatment." They created this committee to take the burden of moral decision away from physicians, assuming that physicians would naturally want their patients to be accepted. The committee of 7 members represented the community: a minister, a lawyer, a housewife, a labor leader, a state government official, a banker, and a surgeon. 2 physicians familiar with dialysis served as advisors and screened applicants for medical unsuitability. The committee worked anonymously and never met candidates. The committee first limited candidates to residents of the state of Washington who were under 45. Candidates had to be able to afford dialysis or have insurance that covered it. Almost immediately, too many patients applied, and additional criteria became necessary. Famously, the committee then considered personal characteristics about possible recipients: employment, children, education, motivation, achievements, and promise of helping others. Criteria somewhat like those used by committees to admit students to medical school. The committee eventually asked for analysis of a candidate's abilities to tolerate anxiety and to manage medical care independently. It considered whether a candidate had previously used symptoms to get attention from relatives and physicians. It evaluated the personality and personal merit of the candidate and the family support for a patient on chronic dialysis. Elderly curmudgeons without siblings or children fared badly. Shauna Alexander publicizes the God Committee, starts bioethics. Before modern bioethics had begun, this committee agonized over distributive justice. In 1962, no philosophers had written about ethical issues of allocating organs. Indeed, no one had written about bioethics at all. At least they had not in the modern sense, in which cases are analyzed to find a just public policy. The major previous writings were in Catholic medical ethics. In May 1962, Dr. Scribner took a patient to Atlantic City for a newspaper convention to lobby publicly for more dialysis machines. In the process, he described to reporters his admissions and policy committee, and it was his account of that committee rather than his appeal for more machines, that made the front page of the New York Times the next day. Life magazine assigned its first woman reporter, Shayna Alexander, to write this story. She spent 3 months in Seattle doing so. Her article appeared in November 1962 and carried the term God Committee, a term that stuck. She described the committee as playing a godlike role in deciding who would live and who would die. She described in detail the committee's criteria, which came to be called social worth criteria, or criteria about a person's worth to society. In the spring of 1963, the Seattle Times ran on its front page a picture of 9 of the center's dialysis patients, with the heading, "Will these people have to die?" As a result of this rescue in the media, the Boeing Corporation and the U.S. Public Health Service offered temporary financial support for the patients identified in the newspaper. In 1965, television reporter Edwin Newman narrated an NBC documentary on the God Committee, Who Shall Live? That year, Congress had added to Social Security 2 national medical programs, Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the indigent, but neither covered dialysis. In Who Shall Live, a congresswoman asks why, if America could have a program to explore space, it couldn't have a dialysis program to save Americans. National interest grew about the story and indirectly about bioethics. The media mattered greatly in this case. Shayna Alexander said that when Scribner went to Atlantic City, he had been angling to get the story into the magazine. With the largest circulation, medical sociologist Judith Swayes agrees that Scribner set out to get publicity. 30 years later, Scribner said that he had been totally naive about the national publicity, that a 1968 article in UCLA Law Reviews gave him a lot of flack, that he had nothing to do with the committee, which had been created and supervised by the King County Medical Society, and that when he had a dying patient who wasn't selected, he tried to circumvent the committee. The story in the Seattle Times about his work could not have been written without the initiation and cooperation of Scribner and other physicians at Seattle hospitals. These physicians manipulated the Seattle Times of Life and NBC News to obtain funds for their patients. Their success began a pattern of using the media when patients needed organ transplants, a pattern that came to be called the Rule of Rescue. The End-Stage Renal Disease Act, ESRADA. The God Committee continued to select and reject candidates for dialysis for nearly a decade. By 1971, many stories had dramatized the plight of patients in renal failure, and that year, Shep Glazer, the president of the American Association of Kidney Patients, testified before Congress. As the story goes, it may be exaggerated. Glazer dialyzed himself before the House Ways and Means Committee, disconnected a tube from the machine, and let his blood flow onto the floor, and said, "If you don't fund more machines, you'll have this blood on your hands." In 1972, Congress legislated for Americans a one-organ right to medical care. The End-Stage Renal Disease Act mandated the federal government to pay for a dialysis machine for any American who needed one. Faced with the problem of distributive justice, of deciding which patients should be funded and how to select them. Some critics believe that Congress took the easy way out and funded all patients. Others say that Congress showed compassion, allowing everyone to live in times of prosperity and passing the buck to later generations about how to pay for it all. Congress passed Israda, an act in session lasting only 30 minutes. The impetus came from a coalition of kidney patients, lobbyists for some physicians, concerns over high rates of kidney failure in people of color, and concerned that too much money was being spent on space and war in Vietnam, but too little on dying people who might be saved. By making dialysis available to all patients, Israda Act ended the problem of allocating machines and ended the need for the God Committee. In retrospect, Israda Act was hastily conceived, and it set an unfortunate precedent. Other groups, such as hemophiliacs, pressed for similar coverage. Senator Vance Hart of Indiana predicted the Israda Act would cost $100 million in the first year. But its cost would then drop sharply because of later efficiencies in production. Willem Kolff said his machines could be mass-produced for $200 each. These predictions are textbook lessons. In how classical supply and demand fell in medical finance. Under cost plus reimbursement under Israda Act, in effect during the 1970s and 1980s, hospitals could buy as many dialysis machines as they wanted and charge the cost plus a percentage of profit to the Israda Act. So Israda Act incentivized them not to buy $200 machines, but to buy $20,000 machines. The larger the cost, the greater the profits they made. In 1983, to rein in out-of-control costs, government tried to reimburse by diagnostically related groups, DRGs, instead of cost funding. Hospitals got around DRGs and costs continued to soar. As yet another way to control costs, managed care started in the 1990s. By 2015, instead of costing $100 million, the 600,000 Americans on dialysis in Israda Act cost Israda Act $28 billion a year, making Israda Act one of the most expensive medical programs in North America. Under Israda Act, Congress also reimbursed kidney transplants. After the approval for use of cyclosporin in 1983, renal transplants jumped from 3,730 in 1975 to 9,000 in 1986. And overall, organ transplants soared to an all-time record of 29,532 in 2015. This development raised new questions. Should every dialysis kidney patient get a kidney transplant? If so, where should the kidneys come from? One thing is certain. What drove the expansion of people on dialysis and people getting kidney transplant was the fact that the federal funds paid for all treatments for the kidney, a situation that existed for no other organ or disease. In contrast, during the next half-century, over 40 million Americans lacked basic medical coverage, but any American suffering from kidney failure had all expenses covered and frequently could go on disability. The birth of bioethics. For complex reasons, Belding Scrivener did something that went against a centuries-old medical practice. He made a public moral dilemma that hitherto and had been discussed only privately among physicians. Bringing this issue to the public's attention created controversy within medicine. As in Karen Quinlan's case, physicians felt that such ethical issues should be handled quietly within the profession. By making this move, Scrivener began the education of the American public about ethical problems in medicine. Scholars now began to publicly discuss problems such as brain death, assisted reproduction, and just allocation. With these articles and new courses, the new interdisciplinary field of bioethics began.